The first thing Keldroven noticed about the Vethara was that they never blinked. Not a metaphor. Not a cultural quirk. Their visual organs, 3 per face, arranged in a shallow triangle above what passed for a nose, simply did not possess the musculature for it. The Vethara watched the universe in one long, unbroken gaze, and they had decided after 17 years of silent observation that humanity was not worth the continued expenditure of attention. The war, such as it was, had lasted 11 days on their end. 11 days of what the Vethara called a pacification cascade, the systematic dismantling of orbital infrastructure, communication relays, and anything else that might allow one species to speak to another. They had not bombed cities. They had simply switched off the lights and waited for the shouting to stop. It hadn't stopped. Kale sat in the cramped observation blister on the underside of the U of Halcyon and watched the Vethara command vessel drift against the star field like a cathedral someone had built sideways. It was enormous. Everything about them was enormous. Their ships, their weapons, their silences. The vessel had been parked in geosynchronous orbit above what used to be the city of Thalasport for 3 weeks now, doing nothing except being there. Being a fact. Being something you couldn't argue with any more than you could argue with weather. "Station 7, said a voice in his earpiece. "They're running another sweep. Angle your panel." Kale tilted the sensor array without looking away from the window. Behind him, in the operations room of the Halcyon, 14 people were doing things with great precision and controlled urgency. The ship's commander, Director Sarah Omalad, ran the room the way a surgeon runs an operating theater. Low voice, no wasted motion, the faint permanent smell of coffee that had been brewed and forgotten. "Any change in their orbit?" Kale asked. "Negative." That was Pris, the navigation specialist, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone reporting something for the 100th consecutive time. Still locked, still watching, that was the thing. 3 weeks since the cascade, and the Vethara hadn't moved. They'd parked their flagship over a major population center, one of the few that still had running water and functional food distribution, and they'd simply observed. Their smaller craft occasionally executed lazy patrols around the planet's terminator line, sensor sweeps that felt more like habit than tactics. The general consensus among the Halcyon's crew was that the Vethara were waiting for something. What precisely, no one had been able to determine. Kale had a theory. He kept it to himself, because it was the sort of theory that made people uncomfortable. He thought the Vethara were curious. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the blister and watched the command vessel's running lights pulse in a slow, irregular rhythm that the analysts had spent 2 weeks trying to decode and eventually concluded was simply aesthetic. The Vethara liked lights. Their own biology operated across a wider visual spectrum than humans. They could see frequencies that human instruments could only infer. The slow pulsing of the running lights, Kale suspected, was the equivalent of someone drumming their fingers. They were waiting, yes, but they weren't bored. They were interested. This was, he had come to understand, significantly more dangerous than if they'd simply been hostile. Kale had not been a diplomat before the cascade. He had been a xenolinguistics researcher at a mid-tier university with a reasonable publication record and a reputation for spending too much time on obscure theoretical frameworks that nobody could immediately monetize. He'd also been the only human being within 3 light minutes who had successfully established a rudimentary symbol set exchange with a Vethara probe, a scout vessel that had appeared in the Kuiper Belt 8 months before the cascade and sat there for 3 weeks broadcasting what initially looked like sensor noise and what Kale, working alone in his apartment at 2 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee and a spreadsheet that had grown to 47 tabs, eventually recognized as a structured grammar. Not language, grammar. The underlying architecture of language, stripped of content, offered like a set of blueprints, without a building. He'd written a paper. The paper had been flagged by 17 different government agencies within 48 hours. And then the cascade had happened. And suddenly Kale was the most important person on the planet, for reasons he found deeply uncomfortable. Droven, Director Omalad's voice. "They're broadcasting again." He pulled himself out of the blister and made his way back into the operations room. The room was arranged in a horseshoe around a central display table, and right now the table was showing the Vethara signal in its raw form. A cascade of structured light pulses that looked, to the untrained eye, like someone was testing a signal generator. Kale sat down in his chair, which the crew had taken to calling the throne, with the exact affectionate sarcasm that made it bearable, and pulled up his working framework. Time index, he asked. Started about 4 minutes ago, said Hirota, the signals analyst, not looking up from his own display. Hirota was 26 and had not slept in what appeared to be several days, which gave his face a quality of determined translucence. Same carrier wave as last time, but the payload is different. Kale looked at the payload. He sat very still for a moment. Sarah, he said. Director Omelade appeared at his elbow. She had a quality of presence that made people stand slightly straighter. Not because she demanded it, but because something in her general bearing suggested that straightness was the appropriate condition for a vertebrate. What am I looking at? They're asking a question, Kale said. The room got quieter. People who were typing stopped typing. People who were talking into headsets lowered their voices. What question? Omelade asked. Kale ran his thumb along the edge of his tablet, a habit he'd developed in graduate school when he was thinking through something that didn't have an obvious shape yet. It's imprecise. Their grammar doesn't map cleanly onto ours, and the symbol set we've been working with only covers about 30% of their apparent semantic range. But as best I can read it, he paused. They're asking why we're still here. Another silence. Longer this time. Why we're still here, Omelade repeated. On the planet, in our cities. They cut the relays, they grounded the fleets. They're asking. Kale stopped. Started again. I think they expected us to leave. Or disperse, or something. They're asking why we didn't. Chris said very quietly. Because it's our home. Yes, Kale said. But I'm not sure they have a referent for that. The first formal communication attempt happened 3 days later. The Halcyon had been positioned through a combination of bureaucratic persistence and Kale's increasingly forceful recommendations at a stable point between the Vethara command vessel and the planet's surface, a location that felt uncomfortably like standing in a doorway. The crew had taken to calling their current assignment the lobby, which Kale thought was either very funny or very bleak, depending on which direction you turned the thought. The communication array had been assembled from components scavenged from 4 different ships, 1 decommissioned relay station, and a piece of Vethara technology, a fragment recovered from the Kuiper Belt probe, that Hirota had spent 3 weeks learning to operate by a method he described as very careful touch and a lot of hope. The resulting system was, by any rigorous engineering standard, a catastrophe held together by duct tape and institutional willpower. It worked, though. Kale had tested it twice, both times receiving what he was reasonably confident were acknowledgement signals from the command vessel. He was less confident about what was actually in those signals. The Vethara's acknowledgements, it turned out, were not simple receipt confirmations. They were layered, structured. They seemed to carry affect, though Kale was careful not to commit to that interpretation in his written reports, because it was the kind of claim that made the people reading the reports spend more time questioning your methodology than absorbing your data. But privately, sitting in the observation blister after the rest of the crew had rotated to their rest cycle, Kale thought the Vethara sounded curious. He thought they sounded like someone who'd set a mousetrap and found, instead of a mouse, a note. He thought they hadn't decided yet what to do about the note. The formal communication began at 0600 ship time, with the full crew at their stations, and 3 different government officials patched in via relay through the planet's surviving ground network. Director Omelade delivered the opening statement, a carefully drafted greeting that Kale had translated into the Vethara symbol grammar over 48 sleepless hours, then translated back into plain language for the officials, then retranslated into the symbol grammar, again after the officials had made 12 changes, then translated back once more, so they could see what those changes had done to the meaning. Then, after a very long meeting, translated one final time into a form that was both politically acceptable and, as far as Kale could tell, coherent. It said approximately, "We are here, we are not your enemy. We are listening." The Vethara took 11 minutes to respond. Their response, when Kale worked through it, said approximately, "We know. We are deciding what that means." Omelade read his translation and said, with a particular inflection of someone who was choosing their words, with the precision of a surgeon choosing an instrument, "Is that good?" "I don't know," Kale said honestly. "I've never met a Vethara. Nobody has, right? So, the thing about a long negotiation," and Kale was beginning to understand, in a way that settled into his bones over the following 3 weeks, that this was going to be a very long negotiation, was that it operated on 2 levels simultaneously. There was the explicit content. The symbols exchanged, the concepts attempted, the misunderstandings surfaced and corrected. And then there was the texture of the exchange itself, the rhythm and pacing and weight of it, which carried its own information entirely separate from what was being said. The Vethara were meticulous. Their responses always arrived in precisely structured packets, internally consistent, grammatically faultless, within the shared framework. They never repeated themselves. They never contradicted an earlier statement without explicitly flagging the contradiction and providing a reason for it. They engaged with Kale's questions the way a mathematician engages with an interesting proof. Not with warmth, exactly, but with a quality of sustained focused attention that he had started to find deeply affecting in a way he couldn't quite name. They also, he was discovering, had no concept of the informal. This came up on what Kale had taken to calling Day 31. Because counting from the cascade felt too large, and counting from the first formal exchange felt too small. And 31 was the day Hirota fell asleep at his station in the middle of a signal analysis. And Kale, coming back from the galley with 2 cups of coffee, spent a moment just looking at his colleague's folded arms and slack face, and feeling something twist in his chest. He covered Hirota with his jacket. This was not, by any rigorous professional standard, a diplomatically significant act, but the monitoring systems on the Vethara command vessel, and Kale had suspected for some time that they were under continuous observation. Though he hadn't mentioned this to the officials on the ground, because it would have triggered a week of committee meetings, had apparently captured the moment. Because the next communication from the vessel, which arrived 4 hours later, contained something new, an inquiry about Kale specifically. It took him most of an afternoon to parse it accurately, partly because the vocabulary was operating at the edge of the shared framework, and partly because what the Vethara appeared to be asking was something he kept expecting to be a mistranslation. He ran it 6 times. He ran it through 2 different analytic systems. He had Hirota, awake by then, apologetic, jacket returned, run it independently. Same result every time. They were asking, "Why did you cover the smaller one?" KSL sat with this for a long moment. Then he typed a response. He typed it in the raw symbol grammar, without running it past Director Omelade or the officials on the ground, which was, he was aware, technically a significant protocol violation. He sent, he was cold, he had been working without rest for too long. I wanted him to be less uncomfortable. The response came back in 40 minutes, which was faster than usual. This serves no tactical purpose. Kale looked at that for a long time. Then he sent, no, it doesn't. The inquiry about Hirota's jacket opened something, though Kale would not have been able to tell you exactly what. The formal exchanges continued, careful, meticulous, advancing at a pace that felt to the Halcyon's crew like pushing a boulder uphill in slow motion. But alongside the formal exchanges, something else had begun. A parallel channel, informal and unofficial, that Kale ran entirely on his own, because he was not at all sure the officials on the ground would approve of it, and he was quite sure that if he stopped it now, they would lose something that could not be recovered. The Vethara kept asking about things, small things. The coffee smell that apparently reached their instruments, or rather, the molecular signature of it, which they had catalogued, and now asked about with a precision that seemed disproportionate to the subject. The rhythm of the crew's sleep cycles. The way Pris had a habit of tapping her fingers against her console in groups of 3, when she was working through a navigational calculation, a rhythm so consistent it had apparently registered as a potential signal before being reclassified. The fact that Kale often spent time in the observation blister alone, in the dark, simply looking at the star field. "What are you doing when you look at the stars?" they asked. Kale thought about this carefully. Then he typed, trying to remember that the problem is smaller than a long pause. Longer than usual. This is a method of managing fear. Partly. Also a method of managing awe. They feel similar. From the inside, another pause. We do not have a word for what you have described. We have a word for understanding the scale of a thing. We have a word for the neurological response to perceiving something larger than the self. We do not have a word for the co-occurrence. Kale stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he typed, "You do now. We call it wonder." The breakthrough when it came was not the formal diplomatic exchange that the government officials later cited in their official record. It was a conversation about a keychain. Hirota had a small object clipped to his work tablet, a ceramic panda figurine, pink, about 3 centimeters tall, bought from a street vendor at a night market 8 years ago, because his niece had asked him to bring her back something small, and he'd found it charming. The figurine had survived the cascade because Hirota had been on the Halcyon when the relays went down and had his tablet with him. It had become, in the weeks since, something of a talisman. People touched it for luck before difficult signal transmissions. Chris had once kissed it before a particularly fraught navigation calculation. The panda, Kale thought, had more social significance in the operations room than any single official had managed to accrue. The Vithara instruments had cataloged the object the way they cataloged everything, as a data point, a feature of the human habitat they were studying. But somewhere in their analysis, something had snagged. The small decorative object, they sent. It has no functional purpose. Multiple individuals interact with it in a ritualized pattern. What is it? Kale looked at the panda. The panda looked back with its hand-painted eyes. He typed, "It was a gift. For a child who wanted something small and beautiful to keep. The person who gave it carries it so that he doesn't feel so far from home." The pause this time was very long. The child is alive. Kale looked at Hirota, who was eating something from a foil packet and reading a report and did not know he was the subject of an interstellar inquiry. He doesn't know, Kale typed. The communication relays went down before he could find out. Another long pause. Then, "We can tell you." Kale put down his tablet very carefully, the way you put down something fragile when your hands have started to shake. "You have access to that information," he typed. "We have observed the surface comprehensively. We can tell you the status of the child. We can tell you the status of any individual you identify, if you provide locating information." Kale sat very still. What happened next was a violation of protocol, a breach of procedure, and entirely outside the scope of his official role. He walked across the operations room, sat down next to Hirota and said, "I need you to give me your niece's last known address." Hirota looked at him. He had the face of someone who had learned, over the past several weeks, to interpret Kale's expressions as potential harbingers of either catastrophe or miracle. "Why?" he said. "Because," Kale said, "I think I can find out if she's okay." Hirota's niece was, the Vithara confirmed, alive and in a shelter in the 3rd district of what had been Thalasport. She was 7 years old. She was with her grandmother. She had, according to the Vithara's observational data, and Kale did not ask how granular that data was, because he thought the answer might alarm him, asked about her uncle in the past week, twice. Hirota did not cry exactly. He made a sound like a system that has been running too hot for too long and has finally been allowed to cool, and he pressed both hands flat on the console in front of him. And for about 30 seconds nobody in the operations room said anything, because some moments are too large for speech. Then Pris put her hand on Hirota's shoulder and said, "I need her grandmother's address." For the same reason. That was how it started. Over the next 6 hours, with the Vithara responding to each inquiry with methodical precision, the crew of the Halcyon located 37 people. Parents, children, partners. A brother in a hospital in the eastern coast, who was recovering from an injury sustained during the initial Cascade event. A friend who had been feared dead and was, in fact, living in a makeshift camp 300 kilometers from where anyone had last heard from him. Each piece of information came back the same way. Factual, precise, stripped of emotional content, and each piece landed in the operations room like something physical, like a weight lifted or set down. Director Omelade found out around hour 4 that her daughter was safe. She got this news sitting at her station in her usual posture, and she absorbed it with a stillness that KL recognized as a very particular kind of effort. And then she went back to work. But her hands were not quite steady for the rest of the shift, and nobody mentioned it. The officials on the ground, when they were briefed the following morning, had a great many questions about protocol, authorization, and the appropriate scope of the xenolinguistics specialist's operational mandate. Kale answered these questions patiently, if not entirely contritely. Director Omelade backed him with the quiet, immovable certainty of someone who had decided, somewhere in the small hours of the previous night, that some rules bend when the thing they're protecting has already been protected. What the officials did not immediately understand, what took them another week to absorb, was what the Vithara had done by answering those questions. They had shown that they were watching. They were always watching, and they knew where everyone was. And they had chosen to share that information rather than use it. This was not, Kale pointed out in his written report, the behavior of a species engaged in a pacification campaign. This was the behavior of a species that was trying to figure out what they were dealing with, and had found, in the middle of an interstellar standoff, that the most useful data point was a ceramic panda, and the person who carried it. The formal negotiations resumed, and they were different now. Not warmer exactly, The Vethera did not do warm the way humans did warm, and Kale had learned to stop expecting it. But there was a quality of genuine engagement that had been absent before, a willingness to slow down at the difficult points and return to them, a patience with imprecision that felt like respect. They had observed enough humans now that they were beginning to calibrate, to understand not just the content of what was being said, but the way humans said it. The hesitations and redirections and the things that happened around the edges of the formal language. You are not a homogeneous group, they sent one morning, early enough that Kale was still on his first cup of coffee. The small female who taps her console. The tall male who fell asleep. The female commander who was still for a long time after receiving information. The male who carries the small object. You are each a different. We do not have the word. Kale thought about it. Person he typed. We call it being a person. This is distinct from individual, slightly. An individual is a unit counted. A person is a unit known. The pause was shorter this time. The Vethara were getting faster. We have counted you. We have not known you. This may be the source of the error. Kale sat up. What error? We determined that removing your communication infrastructure would result in species-level behavioral modification, retreat, dispersal, or cessation of territorial claims. This is the observed response of species at your technological level when faced with superior force. You did not respond this way. No, Kale typed. We didn't. We have been attempting to understand why. Our current hypothesis is that the territorial response in your species is not driven by strategic assessment, but by something prior to strategy. Something that does not respond to force calculations, because it is not itself a calculation. Kale looked at the screen for a moment. What do you think it is? He typed. We do not have a word. They sent. We were hoping you did. He thought about Hirota pressing his hands flat on a console. He thought about Omalade's hands, not quite steady. He thought about what it felt like to stand in a cold observation blister and press your forehead against the glass and look at the star field and remember that you were a small creature on a spinning rock in an enormous darkness and still feel in your chest the specific weight of every street you'd ever walked down and every smell of rain on pavement and every face you'd ever loved. We call it home, he typed. It is the place where you become yourself. It is the people who have known you long enough to know which version of you to expect on a given day. It is the particular quality of the light in a specific window at a specific time of year. It is the weight of belonging to something that was here before you and will be here after. It is the place that if you lose it, you lose a piece of what you were and know it and grieve it. He paused. You cannot force it away. You can destroy it, but you cannot make us unfeel it. That is why we didn't disperse. Not because we calculated that staying was strategically optimal. Because there was no calculation. Because home is prior to strategy. He sent it. He sat back and drank his cold coffee and waited. The response took 4 hours. During those 4 hours, the Vethara command vessel did not move. Its running lights pulsed in their slow, irregular rhythm. The crew of the Halcyon went about their duties with the particular focused quiet of people who understand that something is happening that they cannot control and have decided collectively to simply be present for it. Pris tapped her console in groups of 3. Hirota polished the ceramic panda with the hem of his sleeve. Director Omalade made a new pot of coffee and brought Kale a cup without being asked, which was, he had come to understand, her specific vocabulary for a kind of care she didn't otherwise express. When the response came, it was longer than any previous transmission. Kale worked through it for 40 minutes, cross-referencing the new vocabulary against his framework, making notes in the margins, backing up and rerunning sections 3 times, until he was confident in the translation. Then he sat back and read it aloud. The operations room was quiet. The Vethara said, "We have observed 2,047 species encounter superior force since our civilization first reached the stars. 1,812 of them modified their behavior to optimize for survival. 206 ceased to exist. 29 maintained an incomprehensible response that our models could not account for. We have always categorized this 29th group as anomalous. We have never examined the anomaly. We have decided to examine it now. We have decided to examine it because of a small pink object, and the person who carries it and what you said about the place that was here before you. We do not have a word for what you described. We have begun constructing one. This will take time. We propose a cessation of the pacification protocols while the word is constructed. We request your continued presence. We believe this is the correct term. We believe it requires a being known, Not merely a being counted. Kale lowered the tablet. In the silence, Hirota said very quietly, "Did they just ask us to stay?" "Yeah," Kale said. "I think they did." The cessation of the pacification protocols took 11 days to formally implement, because that was how long it took to verify that the relays were genuinely being restored and not merely suppressed to a lower frequency, and because several officials on the ground wanted the verification run twice, and because verification of alien orbital technology is not a process that accommodates haste. The morning the first relay came back online. The morning the first unencrypted signal from the surface reached the Halcyon's receivers without running through the Vethara communication framework. Hirota was at his station when the channel cleared. He had given his niece's grandmother's relay address to the communications officer the night before. Quietly, the way you do something when you're afraid that hoping will invite disappointment. The call came through at 0714 ship time. Kale was in the observation blister. He could hear Hirota's voice through the open corridor hatch. Not the words, just the voice, the quality of it. The way it changed in the first seconds of a call that had been awaited for more than a month. He did not go to look. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and looked out at the Vethara command vessel and its slow pulsing lights, and he thought about the word they were building. And he thought about all the words that exist only because something needed a name. And he thought, this is it. This is the specifically human thing that no force calculation can account for. Not the stubbornness, though there is stubbornness. Not the ingenuity, though there is ingenuity. It is the fact that we named the feeling before we solved the problem. It is the fact that the ceramic panda mattered before the negotiation mattered. It is the fact that when you ask us why we stayed, the answer is not a strategy. The answer is a person's voice on a channel that shouldn't be open yet, talking to a child who wanted something small and beautiful to keep. The stars hung there in their old indifferent splendor. Kale held his coffee. Hot. This time he'd finally remembered to drink it, and felt, in the particular morning silence of a ship suspended between a planet and an alien vessel, something that had no tactical value whatsoever. Relief. And something that lived just past it, in the same neighborhood, with the same quality of light. He thought the Vethara might not have a word for it yet. He thought they were working on it. The summit, if you could call it that. If a diplomatic meeting between two species who had been exchanging signals for 7 weeks across an improvised communication array qualified as a summit, was proposed by the Vethara 3 days after the relays came back online. Not on the Halcyon, not on the command vessel, on the surface. Specifically, they proposed the third district of what had been Thalasport, which was where Hirota's niece was living with her grandmother, in a shelter that had running water and solar power, and a small community garden that someone had planted in the rubble of what used to be a park. The Vethara had chosen the location deliberately. They had, it emerged, been observing the shelter for some time. They had noted the garden in particular. "We have not observed this before," they sent. In the aftermath of a force engagement, the deliberate cultivation of food in a damaged space. It does not optimize for caloric efficiency. The area could be used for shelter construction. The individuals responsible have chosen instead to grow flowering plants alongside the food plants. We do not understand the decision. We believe it may be relevant to the word we are constructing. Kale thought about the garden for a long time before he responded. Then he typed, "You're not wrong, it is relevant. Come and ask them directly. They'll explain it better than I can." The first Vethara stepped out of their landing craft and onto the surface of a human city on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the light was the particular clean gold that follows rain, and the air smelled of wet concrete and the faint green smell of growing things. There were 4 of them. They were tall, nearly 2.5 meters, bilateral, with limbs that moved in a way that suggested a different default relationship with gravity. Their 3 eyes tracked independently in a way that humans instinctively read as hypervigilance, but which, Kale had come to understand, was simply how they looked at the world. All of it, all at once, nothing filtered out. They did not blink, they walked carefully. Their footfalls were light for creatures of their mass, as if they were conscious of the ground's history. They looked at the city around them, at the damaged buildings and the makeshift infrastructure and the signs that had been repainted by hand, and the children who had stopped what they were doing to stare, with an attention that was not cold, not warm, not anything Kale had a word for yet. Hirota was there, with his niece on his shoulders. The child was 7, small, dark-haired, holding a new ceramic panta she had made herself out of clay from the community garden. painted with whatever paint she could find, which was not pink, but a particular brave orange that Kale thought privately was better. The lead Vithara, the one who had been doing most of the formal signaling, who Kale had privately named the architect because of the precise structural quality of their transmissions, stopped in front of them. All three eyes settled on the child, then on the orange panda, then back on the child. Hirota's niece looked at the enormous alien standing in front of her and did not run, which Kale thought was either bravery or the particular practical courage of a 7-year-old who has been living in a shelter and has recalibrated her scale of scary things. She held out the orange panda. "I made it," she said. Kale translated this. I translated it precisely and without embellishment, because it did not need embellishment. The architect looked at the panda, looked at the child, looked at Kale. Then it reached out, with the careful deliberateness of something very large that has learned to be aware of its own size, and accepted the panda, held it. Its three eyes studied it with the same focused attention it had given to grammar and strategy, and the mystery of why humans stayed. It said something. Kale listened. He ran it 3 times in his head. He felt something happen in the back of his throat that he was going to attribute, in the official record, to dust. He crouched down to be at the child's level and said, "They said it is small and beautiful, and they will carry it so they don't feel so far from home." The child nodded, very seriously, as if this was the correct answer, and she had expected nothing less. And in the garden beside the shelter, among the flowering plants that someone had grown, because the math on it didn't work but the need for it did. In the clean gold light of a spring morning on a planet that had been switched off and had refused to go dark, the word the Vethara were building got a little closer to being finished. It was going to be a good word. Kale thought it was going to sound, in their language, something like wonder.